Okay. Yesterday we got into the Gemara. The Gemara spoke about the question about the Yada Shel Adam. We saw yesterday with the question, what's the status of a person's hand when a person goes out, takes his hand, and he has some food in his hand, and he sticks his hand out from private property into public property. The question was, um, did the rabbis give him a knas? Did the rabbis fine him and say that he cannot bring his hand back into the domain that he's in? Let's say he's standing in private property, he sticks his hand out into public property. And we said that the hand of a person does not have the status. If he's standing in private property, the hand and he sticks his hand out into public, the hand does not have the status of private property. If he's standing and vice versa. So the question was, the Gemara wanted to know, do we give it a status, its own status, like a Carmelis? The word Carmelis is, according to the Rambam, it's like a language of a widow. A widow is not a virgin, but it's also she's not married. She's in between, so to speak. So too, this domain is in between. It's not a public domain. A Carmelis is not a public domain. It's not a private domain. It's its own type of domain. Let's say we said an ocean, a valley, a place it resembles public a little bit, but it's not totally public. It resembles private. It has some similarities to private and to public, and the rabbis were concerned if you're going to go ahead and carry from public into this type of place, or from this place into public or into private, people might make a mistake and actually carry into a real public property or real private property. So therefore, the rabbis said that you can't carry from a public place into a Carmelit or a private place into a Carmelit, and that's a rabbinic law, or to carry four amot, 6 to 8 feet in the Carmelit. Now, if the hand has the status of a Carmelit, then you wouldn't be able to pull back. You can't take something from a Carmelit, from a domain that's, let's say, rabbinic domain of a Carmelit, to take it into public property or into private property. So therefore, if we gave this hand with the food a different status, so then you would have to leave your hand out and leave your hand stretched out until the end of the Shabbat, because if we would give it a status of a Carmelit. So that's how the Gemara Abaye's question was, and he wanted to bring an answer to his question, but he found two Breita. One Breita says if your hand was filled with fruit and you stuck your hand out with the fruit, that means you're in private property and you stuck your hand out with fruit into public property. One Breita says you're not allowed to bring your hand back in, and another Breita says you're allowed to bring your hand back in. So one Breita says you have to keep your hand outstretched until Shabbat is over. You can't move that hand from that other domain into the domain that you're in. And one says that you're allowed to. So the Breitos did not tell us what the reasoning for their ruling is. The Breita just says a ruling that if your hand was stretched out, and you had food in your hand, and you're standing in one domain, the item is in a different domain. We gave the example, you're standing inside the house, and your hand is with the food out, and the hand is outside the house. So one says you can pull your hand back in, and one says you can keep your hand outstretched. So the Gemara was suggested, was probably they're arguing whether we gave this hand the status of a Carmelit or not. If you hold, you cannot pull your hand back, because we give your hand a separate ruling of a Carmelit, a new domain with a rabbinic prohibited domain, and you can't carry from a Carmelit into private property. So but the opinion that says that you could actually pull your hand back holds that it's not a Carmelit. It did not get a status of a rabbinic domain that's prohibited to carry from within or from there to public or private. and therefore you could go ahead and pull it back in. That's what the Gemara wanted to suggest. And to that, the Gemara said, look, the Gemara said, and I think Nathan's point yesterday, that the Gemara wanted to say, maybe everybody holds the Kuliyamaka Carmelit dummy, maybe everybody would hold to have the status of a Carmelit, that it will be a rabbinic prohibited domain to carry to private or to public. But the argument with so why does, if everyone holds it's a Carmelit, so why does one allow you to pull it back in? You're not allowed to carry from a Carmelit into private property. So the Gemara says because it's higher than 10 tefachim. If the item is higher than 10 tefachim, which is technically airspace that will not make a person liable for carrying a Shabbat if the item is over 10 tefachim. It's not considered the Rishut HaRabim, the area that would be public, that would be forbidden. So therefore the Gemara says that's the allowance that you could pull it back in is when it's higher than 10 tefachim, higher than, let's say, around 10 tefachim, maybe 35 to 40 inches. So that's what the Gemara wanted to say over here. Now, and the Gemara now says another answer. Idi v'idi, maybe both Braitos are talking lamata me'asara. There's another way you can learn that maybe both cases are talking when it's less than 10 tefachim. That means it's within the area that should be prohibited. It's called the Avir Rishut HaRabim. It's called the airspace, public airspace, and it's subjected to the Torah prohibition of carrying from private to public and public to private. But both Braitos holds Lavka Karmelit Damya, that the hand does not get this status of a new domain of a Carmelit, and you can't carry from it into private or from it into public. It does not get that status. Now, if it does not get that status, so why would you not be able to move your hand back in? It's not a new domain. It's not a new domain, so why can't you move your hand back in? V'lo kasha, there's no contradiction. Kan mibod yom. The question is, when did he stretch his hand out? When did he put his hand outside into public property? He was standing in private property. He stretched his hand out into public property with something in his hand. Now, if he would finish the act and take the item that he stretched his hand outside and place it down in public property, he has violated the Torah law. So, but if he went ahead and he put his hand out before Shabbat, there's no Torah law that he could violate, because the akira, the uprooting of the item, happened before Shabbat, right? In order to violate the Shabbat, you have to uproot, pick up an item on Shabbat, uproot it, move it from one domain, from one private domain to public or public to private. But here, if he picked up the item and he stretched his hand out before Shabbat, so now there's no biblical concern. So therefore, the Gemara wants to say, so the rabbis did not give him a fine. We did not fine him if he put his hand out. We did not fine him if he put his hand out at that time. However, if he put his hand out at night, then we will, which he did a biblical violation, or not biblical violation, but he can't come to biblical violation, we will give him a fine. Okay, so let's see what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says, Kan mechashecha. When he stuck out his hand, and the Gemara says like this, Mibod yom, if he put his hand out before Shabbat, and he didn't pull his hand back in before Shabbat, look, Konsur Rabbanat, the rabbis did not give him a fine, because like we said, he put his hand out before Shabbat. However, Michashecha, But if he put his hand out when it was already dark, meaning it was already a Shabbat, so he did an act that can lead to a biblical prohibition. Konsur Rabbanan. The Rabbanan gave him a fine, meaning to say it's not a Carmelite. It doesn't get its own status of a new domain called a Carmelite, which would be a rabbinic forbidden domain. His hand does not get that status. But there's a different issue. You don't have to be a Carmelite. You don't have to have a status of a Carmelite for us to forbade you to bring your hand back in. We're going to forbade you to bring your back in because you did a sin. Morning, Ariel. Great to see you. The guy did a sin by sticking his hand out on Shabbat with food in his hand, and therefore we're going to give you a fine because I would say the fine could be because we're afraid that you're going to come, you might come actually to drop it down in the public property. That's what the Gemara says. Ariel, you're comfortable with the French Gemara, but you have the English Gemara. You can use the English. Use the English Gemara. So we are on 3b. In this translation, we are on 3b, 3b2. Okay, so the Gemara is discussing, just to bring you up to date, the Gemara says on Shabbat, if a guy had food in his hand, as you know, on Shabbat, you can't take something from private property at one of these and put it to public property. You can't take from public property, put it to private property. You transfer an item from this domain, private to public or public to private is a problem. That's the biblical prohibition of carrying on Shabbat. The question was, if I went ahead and I stuck out my hand outside and I caught myself. Now the question is, am I allowed to bring my hand with the food? I had food in my hand and I stuck my hand outside, or I had a book in my hand. I had one of these cards in my hand. I stuck it outside. Nathan likes to give it to the Kohanim to make sure they have kavanah, right? They stuck in a hand outside. Now, but it's Shabbat. The guy said, what are you doing? It's Shabbat. Am I allowed to put my hand back in? I can't drop it here. I'm standing inside the building, inside private property, and my door opens right into public property, just like right over here. This door opens right into public property. Now, again, if you stuck your hand out, now the only, if people hold, there's an Eruv, you can make an Eruv. Hold it, you can make an Eruv. Well, let's say if you hold, you can't make an Eruv. If you hold, it's a public property on a Torah level. So if you stick your hand outside with the item, are you allowed to bring your hand back in? Are we going to give you a fine and say, you had no right to do that? You should not have stuck your hand out with an item in your hand on Shabbat. You went over the threshold, whatever you went, you moved your item from private into public, but the only thing is you didn't place it down. To violate the Shabbat, you have to do two parts. You have to uproot it and place it in private and place it down in public, or uproot it in public or place it down in private. You uprooted it, you moved it, but you never did putting down. So do we give you a fine and say you have to leave your hand extended? And you can't go ahead and bring it back in. So the Gemara was discussing, the Gemara was thinking that maybe it would be dependent if the hand gets a status of a Carmelite. The Carmelite is a domain that's a certain rabbinic prohibited domain to carry in. Something that's not a public property, but not private. It's not, and it's not public, it's not private, it's like an in-between type of thing, has similarities to public and private, and the rabbis forbade you to carry from there into private or there into public, so that your hand get that status. So the Gemara says, this answer the Gemara says it doesn't have a status of a Carmelite, but but we're still going to give you a fine according to what, if you violated the rabbinic law, if you did if you did one part, you did this act that you should not have done, you put your hand out on Shabbat, we're going to fine you that you can't bring your hand back in. And now, if you do that, you'll never come to put your hand out. You'll never come to lead to possibly getting to the actual sin of going from private to public with an item in your hand. So that's So that's what the Gemara just said. The Gemara.
Shabbat, you have the food, and if before Shabbat you put your meal 2,000 away, you're able
right before, right, a little less than 2000, 1999. Let's say.
By another 2,000. But now you want to have lunch.
So you can't travel, you can't walk on Shabbat outside the city to the boundary. How far you could walk on Shabbat? Meaning, if let's say you're in the country area, when you have houses all along, then it's all considered like one city. You could travel. You could walk from here. You want to walk, to Harlem, you can walk. But if you leave a city and when it's a certain distance, in order for you, if you want to extend your ability to walk, so Nathan's saying, so before Shabbat, you place a certain amount of food, let's say within the 2,000 amot, let's say, and then if you place the food there, that's like your home. And therefore, if I place it, let's say 1,900 amot away from where I am now, from my home. So that food is called an eruv techumim. That food gives you the allowance on Shabbat to walk. To walk. Let's say I'm going 2,000 amos uptown, further up the east side. So let's say this is a desert. There's no houses over here. So I could go if I put food 1,900 amot from the shul, more uptown. That becomes like my home. So I could walk from here. I could walk to there on Shabbat, 1,900 amot, and then I get another up to 2,000 amot past that, because I made that like my home. If I would not have put the food there before Shabbat, I only could go from here, from this. Let's say this is my house. I could go up until 2,000 amot. But once I made that my home, so because I put my food there, they made that eruv. The rabbi said, now you could go up to 2,000 amot from where that food is.
But
yes.
Mario asked, "Are you allowed to eat it?" Which was going to be my question.
Yes. That. Okay. But you're not moving anywhere. Again, you're in. That's you're not moving. You're not carrying it anywhere. You're staying in that spot and you're eating it, because you can't carry in that area.
It's sitting on the floor. I'm hungry. I'm having my picnic lunch there. I have to pick up the food.
Right. So you're in the same. Right. You're not moving. You're not traveling with it. You're not walking with it. You're in the same spot.
You acquired it and you deposited it.
Right. But your status will be in the place where the item is. I mean, if I'm out in the street, let's say I drop my yarmulke in the street, right? So, and let's say if the street is a place where I can't carry, let's say where there's no roof, I can go ahead and pick up my yarmulke has fallen on the street. It's now resting in public property, and exactly. And I'm not walking with my yarmulke, holding my yarmulke in my hand and walking dalet amot, because that would be a problem. I can't also walk 4 amot, as Nathan says. I can't carry 6 to 8 feet in public property. So now what I understand, we can look up again, we shouldn't even walk less than dalet amot in public property, because you might come to go 4 amot in public property. But the best thing is, what you're supposed to do is, my yarmulke is here, I stand still, I bend down, I pick up my yarmulke, I put it on my head, because where am I? I'm in public property. I'm not private property. But if I'm in public, I'm in public. If I'm in private, I'm in private. So the yarmulke has the status, it's in public property. I'm standing in public property. I'm not traveling. I'm not moving with the yarmulke. I just picked up the yarmulke and I put it on my head. That's fine. But our Gemara Nathan is talking about the issue of when you're transferring an item from private, or there's movement of an item from private to public, or from public. But when I'm in the public property and my yarmulke is in public property, then the only issue is, like you said before, I can't walk. Right, no, the eruv techumim food, correct. If the eruv techumim food is Now, if I placed it in a house, if we have to see where the halacha took, then you're right. If the food is near near a tree or so whatever it is, that area is going to be definitely an area that's not a private area, right? I put it somewhere over there. If it's not a private area, then it depends. I wouldn't be able to carry it 4 amot. Because if it's a public area, Nathan, I can't carry 4 amot to public. If it's a Carmelit, which is not public, not private, it's also I can't carry 4 amot. So you're right. I can't go 4 amot with that food, walk with it, but I could stay in that place and eat it. If I have food in somewhere, I could stay in that place and eat the food. As long as I don't walk with the food, I don't move with the food. Stay in the place. Yes. Amot, 900 amot, right? Not to carry. That's best be clear. You could walk. Well, meaning it's not an issue of carry. Right.
Your new center of gravity, you go up to.
Right. It's only a. You're right. This is very clear, very clear. Right. See, Nathan brought up a different subject, but he was connecting how does it apply over there as well. His subject is not about carrying. It's not this issue. It's not about taking up, picking up. It's about how much could you walk on Shabbat. There's actually a restriction of how far a person can walk on Shabbat. I have nothing in my pockets. Nothing in my pockets. How far can I walk on Shabbat? So if I'm in the country and I'm in the area where there's no houses, let's say and I have my house, and the next house is who knows how far. So then I am restricted and how far I could walk on Shabbat. That is, you see what I'm saying? Ariel, that's what we're talking about. And but if I place this food within 2,000 amot from my home, that becomes my new starting point, and I could travel, walk, no carrying. We're not talking about carrying at all. Nathan's question was, okay, Rabbi, you put the food there. What are the laws? Can you pick up that food and eat it? Shabbat. Now that becomes your place of residence. That's your house. That's where you eat. You could pick it up as long as you don't walk with it and carry with it, with the food.
So if you walk,
you can never carry that food if the food is placed. You placed it before Shabbat. Wherever you placed it, you could eat it in the spot. That spot you could eat it, but you don't walk with it. Yes.
Going back to the other question, what's the restriction? How far you can walk if there are houses all around you?
If they have all, you can walk as much as you want, but
okay.
But I mean that's why a person could go from First Street in Manhattan, and you want to go up to a 200th Street in Manhattan, you could walk. But I don't think it's the spirit of Shabbat. Meaning to say, the spirit is not that the Shabbat I should spend the whole Shabbat walking. That's my whole Shabbat. I'm walking the whole Shabbat. I walk 200 blocks. Now, a person has to walk to the hospital, whatever it is, so a situation comes up. But then a person, there's nothing wrong to take a walk on Shabbat. But then I'm going to spend hours walking on Shabbat,
Kids live 50 or 60 blocks away who walk to a meal.
Right. But that's, again, 50, 60 blocks away is not 200 blocks away, Nathan.
No, 50, 60 blocks is way more than
right, but it's within, but like Ralph said, as long as there are houses, there's no problem. You have no problem.
But that is in the scripture. You were saying, let's say your kids are 200 blocks away and you're walking that much with them. That's in the spirit of Shabbat because you're having fun.
Yeah, but I'm saying, yeah, but still, right, still city, right. But I'm saying, there's some. You might be saying, Nathan, you folks, that the meal is a spirit of Shabbat, but the actual effort, what I would say, of walking 200 blocks on Shabbat, using so much of the time of Shabbat to walking, I think it's not so much that, Shabbat is supposed to be a little bit more of a restful, I would say, type of day. And if you're going to walk 200 blocks, I don't know. Again, I'm not saying it's forbidden. No, it's not forbidden. It's not forbidden. I know someone that came from Brooklyn and he walked from Flatbush and Avenue, whatever, Morning Avenue R to the Lower East Side on Shabbat. He came for a simcha, exactly similar to what you're saying. Morning, he felt it was a family or something, and he walked in. But maybe on a special occasion, a certain thing. But in general, for a person to say, you know what, every Shabbat, good morning, every Shabbat I'm going to be walking for 4 hours. I don't think it's ideal type of. I think the day of Shabbat was not given to take 3-4 hour walks. The day of Shabbat is given for much more holier. You want to take a 3-4 hour walk, do it on Sunday. On Shabbat, spend your time with the Beit Midrash, spend your time with family, spend your time with the Shabbat, but not that, now I got to get on my walking shoes, I got to get on my sneakers, and I got to start, it's like it becomes a little bit more of a weekday. Good morning, Asaf. That's how I would, I would say. There is a question in halacha whether, is this a biblical, again, rabbinic prohibition to go outside a city 2,000 amot and about 3/4 of a mile, that would be a rabbinic prohibition. But what would be there is an opinion that says going outside the tchum, walking too far, would be a biblical prohibition. And but that case would only be if you go like a number of hours, meaning to say, not if you walk outside the city 2,000 amot, that, which is about, let's say 4,000 feet, that's not going to be a biblical prohibition. Biblical prohibition would be if the size of the camp of the Jewish people traveling, going, which let's say, which would be, a few hours of walk outside the, something like that.
What happens if the place of worship? What happens if the place of worship you go to is very far away?
Right. So therefore right. So as long as we said, as long as if the house is all along the way, there's no problem. But
your shul is 4 miles.
What if you're in the country?
But
his house, right? So therefore, there's no problem. Again, 4 months. Yeah, there wouldn't be any problem with that. Okay, let's continue in the Gemara. So the Gemara says, so 2 miles is not a big deal, right? Houses, right? It's more than 2,000 feet. It's more than 4,000 feet, but it's 2 miles is not a problem, no issue. I'm talking about hours, people in the spirit of Shabbat. Okay, so the Gemara says, and welcome myself back. The Gemara says, Adarabba, the Gemara says, on the contrary, Ipcha mitzavra. Maybe you should say the opposite logic. What's the opposite logic? If you put your hand out before Shabbat, right? We're talking about a guy has item in his hand, and he stuck his hand out before Shabbat. He stuck his hand out before Shabbat with this item. Now, if you're going to forbade him and say, right, he stuck it outside into the street, he didn't put it down. If you're going to forbade him to put it back in, pull it back in, God bless you. If he stuck his hand out on Shabbat, and you forbade him to pull it back in, and it's going to be hard for him to hold his hand out until the Shabbat is over. So what might he do? He might throw the food item down. He might drop it down. If he drops it down, that would complete the biblical prohibition, because he went on Shabbat. He took an item from private. He stuck it right, and he stuck his hand out. So then if he drops it, that concludes the act, right? The beginning of the act is picking it up in private property. And the conclusion of the act is hanacha, by placing in public property. So therefore, that would be a biblical violation. If he put his hand out before Shabbat and he drops it, if you forbade him to put his hand back in with the item and he drops it because it was difficult for him, he did not do a biblical violation. Why not? Because the original uprooting of the item when he extended his hand was done before Shabbat. If you extend your hand before Shabbat Asaf, if someone stands out inside, and before Shabbat he extends his hand outside, and he keeps it there for a while, he's doing the Guinness Book of World Records, how long he can keep his hands outside, and then he drops it. Did he violate the Torah's law? No. Why not? Because when he originally extended his hand with the item, he did that extension when it was not Shabbat. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was still daylight. The sun was still up. The sun hasn't set. So he put his hand out 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So now it's Shabbat, and it's Shabbat, and the food is still, and the item is still extended in public property. He was supposed to pull his hand back before Shabbat. Don't keep your hand extended from private to public with a food item in your hand. But he didn't put it back in before Shabbat. He left it extended from 4 to 5 or whatever it was. Now, technically now sunset from 4 to 4:30, 4:31 to 2, whatever time sunset is. Now we're going to tell him you cannot pull your hand back. Now, and there's no concern he might, and what Rabbi, but you know, if you're going to give him, you can tell him the kid, why does he have to leave his hand out the whole Shabbat? Now, first of all, it's very hard to imagine. How could a person leave his hand out the whole Shabbat, right? But if you're going to tell him that he can't put his hand back in, I mean, it's an interesting question. How can you say a person, unless we're going to give him such a fine, with the Gemara even suggests that we should give the guy such a fine? But it's interesting, you know, it's something to think about. But the Gemara says, if you tell him not to pull his hand back, if he drops it, there will never be a biblical prohibition. But if the guy before Shabbat, if on Shabbat, puts his hand out with an item, if you forbade him to pull it back in, you know what might happen? He might drop it, because it might be hard for him. If he drops it, then he would have completed a biblical violation of going from private to public on Shabbat. So why do we give him a fine, and yet we say we still give him the fine? We're going to be more strict if he began the act on Shabbat than if he began the act before Shabbat. So the Gemara says, Adarabba, why don't we answer the opposite? The opposite is logical. Mibod Yom, before Shabbat, if he extended his hand with an item before Shabbat, and he extended into the public property, he's standing in private. The Isha delay, if he throws it down, if he throws it down, when Shabbat comes, he drops it. Since he started it before Shabbat, he will not come to violation and bring a korban chatat. A korban chatat is a sin offering for violating the Shabbat. The guy carries on Shabbat from private to public, he has to bring a sin offering. So l'kinsur Rabbanan, let the rabbis give him a fine. However, michashecha, once he extended his hand when it was dark, the ishadi lehu, if he drops it down, he'll come to the biblical prohibition and the requirement of bringing a sin offering for violating the Shabbat unintentionally. The rabbi should not give him a fine. So why didn't so the Gemara said, why didn't the people in the yeshiva give such an answer? The Gemara says, the fact that we didn't give such an answer, tipsho de Rabbi bar Abaye. We can answer a question of Rabbi bar Abaye. What was Rabbi bar Abaye's question? Hidbik pat betana. You know, in those ovens, those days, what they do, they would stick the dough, make the flour, the dough, and they would stick it into the wall of the oven. And they stuck it into the wall of the oven to bake, right? So cooking on Shabbat is one of the 39 you're not allowed to bake on Shabbat. And what happened if a guy, he did not know, he forgot it was Shabbat, and he placed the dough into the oven, and he did that before Shabbat. On Shabbat, he made a mistake. He placed the dough into the oven. So now, there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove the dough in general. Let's say a guy before Shabbat. Before Shabbat, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he went ahead and he placed the dough against the wall of the oven. 4 o'clock in the afternoon before Shabbat. He's supposed to take that dough off that wall before Shabbat enters. But he left the dough stuck to that wall of the oven, and Shabbat came. The law is you're not allowed to take, if you put in the dough before Shabbat, right? You put it in 4 o'clock before Shabbat, you were supposed to take it out before Shabbat, but you forgot to take it out before Shabbat. Now it's Shabbat. Can I take the dough out of the oven? It's already baked. The rabbis say you can't take out that from the oven. Why? So some say, the Rambam, some say because it's more like a type of act that you do during the weekdays, taking out that dough scraping off the dough from the walls of the oven. It's a weekday activity. The rabbis forbade you to do that type of weekday activity on Shabbat. So therefore, you cannot remove that dough from the wall of the oven on Shabbat. It's not the right. Right. Now there was a Bibi had a very interesting case. What about if a guy went ahead and he violated the rabbinic law? Not violated. Yeah, yes. He went ahead and he left the dough there before Shabbat, right? Or the other way. The guy went ahead on Shabbat, he stuck the dough in the oven. So he did. See, he did that. He's not allowed to, stick dough in the oven on Shabbat, right? It might come to bake. Now, but there's a rabbinic prohibition to remove the dough. But if you remove the dough before it bakes, you don't violate the Torah law. Because the Torah law will only be violated if you actually baked. So if you removed it, so now the question is, are you allowed to remove that dough from the oven, which would be a rabbinic prohibition, to save yourself from the Torah prohibition of baking on Shabbat? Stay tuned tomorrow. All the best, everybody. Have a great day. Ralph, I love that smile. Have a great, Torah makes you happy. Torah is it's a great drug. It's a great drug. It's the best drug. Yeah. Yes, you can take it, put it on your head. Yes. In the same spot, but don't carry.